I'm going to begin by just going through a number of eras, and I'm going to start with 1607. And I know this is outside of the time period that we have to know for our AP test, but it gives us some important context for what you have to know. The 1607 to 1754, which is the period right before the Revolutionary era, is sometimes referred to as the Colonial Period. And the Colonial Period is important to know because it is going to be the time period where we start to see the establishment of slavery in the United States. As well as the growth of slavery as a major economic system in America. And that is really important because obviously the creation of slavery and the start of slavery is going to, there we go, that's better. The start of slavery is going to create a context for an important history that is going to carry on through the Revolutionary Period, the Antebellum Period, and during the Civil War and Reconstruction. So it's during this time period that slavery becomes established in the colonies. And it is important to note that slavery in early colonial American history was not just limited to the South, like we sometimes think of it. Instead, slavery was in all colonies at this time period. So slavery in the colonial period was something that was in the North, it was in the South, it was in the middle colonies, and you do need to be aware of that. In addition, it is important to note that it's also the beginning of slave laws in British North America. So we see the first slave laws emerge as the colonists begin to really kind of codify what slavery is early on in America. And that is really important because when they begin to codify slavery as early as the colonial period, it's based on a number of things. And one of those things is race. And so race becomes like a major part of American history that is going to become one of the dark legacies of American history that can be traced all the way through to the colonial period. Now, continuing on, during this time period, just a few important events to note that we should probably just be aware of is that the first African slaves were brought into the United States around 1619. So that's when the first African slaves come by force. When I say America, I mean British North America. It's also important to note that by really the 1640s, we see the first slave laws being passed. So Massachusetts actually has one of the first slave laws, which was passed in 1641, which kind of recognizes slavery as a legal institution. But by 1661, you've got Virginia passing slave laws which make slavery perpetual. What that means is all of a sudden slavery becomes defined as something that is inherited through the mother. And so slavery is something that it carries on through birth, which becomes one of the defining characteristic of American slavery during this time period. In addition to that, we also see some important events that also help define slavery in the colonial period. For example, there's Bacon's Rebellion, and Bacon's Rebellion is not a slave revolt, but it is a revolt of indentured servants that lead to a lot of Americans turning to slavery as the dominant form of labor system during the colonial period. And another thing that we absolutely must know during this time period is the growth of the triangular trade, and specifically the Middle Passage. And the Middle Passage becomes an important term to understand because it helps us know how a lot of Africans were forced to come to America and how they migrated to the United States against their will as part of this larger triangular trade. Okay, so that takes us to our next time period. And our next time period, now we're starting to get into the era of the test. So our next time period I'm going to cover from 1754 to 1790. And this is the Revolutionary Period. So it's during this time period that the United States is going to begin having conflicts with Great Britain, and they're going to fight a war. And then in the immediate aftermath, they have to decide exactly what their new government is going to look like. So kind of just an idea of what you need to know in regard to like this time period. You need to be aware of the following things. The first thing is that, blacks are going to participate in the American Revolution on both sides and play an important role in the American Revolution itself. So there are promises of freedom on both sides of the Revolutionary War. On the American side, you've got the Declaration of Independence, which is promising this idea of all men being created equal. And on the other side, the British were offering like emancipation for anyone who would fight against the colonies during the American Revolution. And so if you were African American at the time of the Revolutionary War, this was a difficult decision to make. Which side did you choose? And so there were a lot of people that fought on both sides. After the Revolution was over, there were advances made for the freedom of African Americans in American society. So after the Revolution, it's kind of a mixed bag. There is some advances for freedom, but it doesn't fulfill the promise of the Declaration of Independence. So, like most northern states are going to abolish slavery in the years following the American Revolution, which is a step forward in creating greater equality within the United States and eliminating the institution of slavery. But there's also a lot of states that maintain this institution. So in southern states and mid-Atlantic states, like, for example, Virginia and Maryland, slavery remains. There's also some other, advances for freedom in this country, especially for African Americans. So, for example, the government under the Articles of Confederation takes steps to ban slavery in Western territories. So slavery is outlawed in the Northwest Territory by the Articles of Confederation. And that's around 1787. So this is also another advance for African Americans, and we start to see challenges to slavery in the Revolutionary period. But it is important to note that there are a lot of failures as well, that America doesn't always live up to its ideals that it had thrown out there in the American Revolution. And a big example of that is not only the fact that slavery isn't abolished in the South, but also when the Constitutional Convention is created, for the most part, there is still not only nothing done about slavery in the South, but there is a recognition through something known as the 3/5 Compromise that those that are enslaved aren't equal to those that are free. So as part of the Constitutional Convention, which happens in 1787, they passed something called the 3/5 Compromise, which recognizes slavery. And under the 3/5 Compromise, all slaves are considered to be equal to 3/5 of a person, or counted as 3/5 of a person. And that is ratified in 1789 with the Constitution. And of course, this poses a major challenge to equality in America and is a major setback for those that are advocating for greater freedom in our history. Now, to kind of continue on with this, from 1790, that's a 90, yes. From From 1790 to 1860, we've got a period of time that's super important that we refer to as the Antebellum era. And this is super important to the history of African Americans, because we see new voices emerge that are going to fight against inequality and slavery, but we also see like slavery becoming protected to a greater extent in the South. We see greater resistance to change as well, which is going to lead us into the Civil War. So we call this time period the Antebellum Period. So this is the Antebellum Period. And some things that you need to know about the Antebellum Period. There's some major developments that are going on. The first development that you have to be aware of is in 1791. You've got the invention of the cotton gin. By Eli Whitney. Now, going back into the Constitutional Convention, a lot of our founding fathers justified the Three-Fifths Compromise and not really taking action on slavery based on the idea that they believed slavery might die out on its own. But the invention of the cotton gin pretty much eliminated that as realistic, like something that would realistically happen. Because with the invention of the cotton gin, all of a sudden, cotton became a very profitable crop that began to be grown in larger amounts in the South. So we see the rise of King Cotton in the South after the creation of the cotton gin. And what that does is the South becomes increasingly reliant on cotton as their main cash crop, and they need more labor. And what ends up happening is this growth of King Cotton directly leads to also a significant increase in the amount of slavery, well, not only that, but the dependence of slavery in the South. And so rather than like serious talks about abolition in the South, we see slavery actually growing and expanding during this time period. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't some advances for African American rights during this time period. Starting in 1808, you've got the outlawing of the slave trade, which is an important step. So slave trade is outlawed, and now legally the Middle Passage is no longer allowed within the United States. But what this does is it leads to a new Middle Passage, what we call the Second Middle Passage. And so while Africans aren't being brought over to the United States via like slave ships like they had been in previous eras, what ends up happening instead is there's this migration from like East Coast states like Virginia, who all of a sudden start selling off slaves down into the deep South where King Cotton is being grown. And there becomes this growth of a slave trade within the United States, which obviously is horrendous as well, because it's ripping families apart. It's leading to like more slaves being placed on the auction block. And this obviously has a huge impact on African Americans. A few years later, in the 1820s and 1830s, you've got another major development, and that is the Second Great Awakening. And the Second Great Awakening is super important because the Second Great Awakening is going to really kind of change the way that people think about slavery within the United States. And so this is going to kind of change people's view on slavery from being an economic argument to being an argument about morality. And it's out of the Second Great Awakening that we see a rise in the abolitionist movement. And the abolitionist movement, there were obviously abolitionists before this time period. There have been an abolitionist movement during the time of the American Revolution. But the abolitionist movement really grows out of the Second Great Awakening. And we have a number of important voices that emerge out of that abolitionist movement in order to speak out against slavery and speak up for the rights of African Americans. Now, one of them is William Lloyd Garrison. who is a radical abolitionist, and he helps create The Liberator, which is an abolitionist like publication. But there's a lot of other important voices as well. There are, for example, Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass is another abolitionist. He's really important because he's a former slave, so he can speak to the conditions of slavery. And he becomes also important in publishing works that speak out against slavery and representing a black perspective on slavery. We also see slave revolts happening during this time period. Nat Turner leads a violent slave revolt in 1831. Of course, by the 1850s, you've got African Americans and you've got whites that are actively I guess, rebelling against the institution of slavery in the form of like the Underground Railroad that's operating through the 1850s. You've got the birth of movements like the Free Soil movement that wants to stop the spread of slavery into Western lands. And so there is becoming a lot more resistance against this institution of slavery. And there's a large number of people that are speaking up for greater rights for African Americans. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't voices opposed to it as well. The South actually starts to kind of become entrenched in their position that slavery is not only necessary economically, but they start to argue that slavery is what we call, they said at the time, a positive good. So you've got people like John C. Calhoun, who's arguing that not only is slavery necessary, but they're arguing during this time period that slavery is beneficial not only to Southerners, but also to the slaves themselves. So like what ends up happening during this time period is both sides harden their position on slavery. All right, so that takes us to our next time period, which is from 1860 to 1877. And really, this is the time period of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Okay, and so there's a lot going on during this time period, and we see a massive change in the rights of African Americans throughout this country due to the Civil War and its immediate aftermath. So there are steps taken to end slavery during the Civil War. A good example of this is the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, I don't know if you remember this, but the Emancipation Proclamation didn't really free any slaves immediately. I think it freed only slaves that were being held by southern states in rebellion that were under Northern control, which was a really, really small percentage. I think it essentially freed the slaves in New Orleans. But the Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued by Lincoln in 1863, gave the Civil War a higher purpose. And we see this also in his Gettysburg Address, when Lincoln talks about a new birth of freedom. And it's about expanding the rights of who is considered to be an American, who should have access to freedom as part of the larger mission statement of that war. And so out of the Emancipation Proclamation, not only does it give the Civil War a higher purpose of ending slavery, but it also, because the Emancipation Proclamation allows African Americans to serve in the Civil War. So we see blacks serving during the Civil War, fighting for the Union armies. I'm going to put Civil War for the Union. Blacks serving during the Civil War for the Union, okay, which is the North. Okay. We also see in the immediate aftermath of that war some major legislation, or in this case, constitutional amendments that are passed that are going to expand freedoms for African Americans. In the immediate aftermath during Reconstruction, you've got the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments passed. And these amendments are really, really important because they, number one, the 13th Amendment ends slavery, it abolishes it, and makes it unconstitutional. The 14th Amendment extends citizenship to like all African Americans, all the former slaves. And that means that now the federal government is going to basically guarantee the protections to all these citizens that are in the Bill of Rights. And then the 15th Amendment gives African Americans the right to vote, African American men. So it creates universal male suffrage. And what this does is it gives, like for the first time, African Americans more political power, and we start to see a greater number of African Americans serving in political office, both within like local, state, and even the federal government. Okay, so this is all coming from that time period. We also see increases in education with the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau. So the Freedmen's Bureau establishes schools in the South under like slavery. Slaves had been denied the right to education. And so now the Freedmen's Bureau is starting to establish, like not only help people feed themselves, provide shelter, but also education is probably the most important legacy of that institution. Now, it is important to know that not all the needs of African Americans were addressed following the Civil War. A big area in which the United States government failed was to provide economic support for like former slaves and for African Americans in the South. So in the South, we see a lot of former slaves kind of returning to plantations as sharecroppers. Because they weren't given any kind of savings, because they weren't given any kinds of land by the federal government in the aftermath, or if they were, they're sometimes taken back. Oftentimes they had to work on someone else's land. And sharecropping became a system of poverty that extended past the era of Reconstruction into the next period that we're going to talk about. Now, there is also important to understand that there are major challenges facing African Americans during the Reconstruction period, despite these gains that I just talked about, and that there is a white backlash, especially within the South, and resistance to these rights that now former slaves are gaining. So this Southern resistance included the following thing. It included immediately after the Civil War something called Black Codes, which were an attempt to reestablish like slavery. What they did was they just tried to kind of like rename slavery and kind of just change the wording of slave laws to kind of put them in place and work around the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, for the most part, eliminated those black codes. Then you add like the rise of hate groups and violent organizations that were white supremacists, such as KKK, which emerged in the 1860s as an organization for ex-Confederate soldiers, who then turned towards terrorizing a lot of not only African Americans in the South, but also Republicans, Southern Republicans. And then by the end of this time period, you've got the rise of the Redeemers. And the Redeemers were Southern Democrats who were eager to gain back power in the South so that they could kind of undo a lot of the changes that happened for African Americans as a result of Reconstruction. So this is like the first part of our story. I'm going to go back a little. Okay, and these are like the first few eras. I'm going to just walk you through now the second part. So let's kind of talk. I'm going to pick up in 1877 with something called the Rise of the New South. So I'm going to just draw my timeline across like so. And we're going to start in 1877, and our next period is going to go from 1877 to 1900. I'm going to then do 1900 to about 1920, and then I'm going to finish with about 1941 till beyond. Okay, so these are the last few time periods that I'm going to look at, and then this will cover us through period 7 for the AP test. So from 1877 to 1900, there's a lot of changes that are going on, both in the South and the North. This is the era of the Second Industrial Revolution. But as far as we're concerned, we're going to label this like, yes, the Gilded Age. Oops. But also the era of the New South. Okay. So up in the north, you've got obviously industrialization, urbanization. Down south, you've got the growth of the New South, which we'll talk about in a second. And then, of course, there's also some things that are happening out west that I want to talk a little about as well. So by 1877, you've got the Compromise of 1877, which means that the North is pulling out of the South. And so suddenly, all of a sudden, the Northern soldiers and the policies that the North were promoting are going to be like systematically like stripped away by politicians who are like returning to power. So let's look at some of the things that happen that represent major challenges to the gains that African Americans have made during Reconstruction. So in the South, I'm going to talk about the South first. You see the rise of something called poll taxes, which were payments that people had to make in order to vote. And then you also had the rise of something called literacy tests. Now, poll taxes and literacy tests were created for the sole intention of trying to prevent African Americans from exercising their political power. So that was the goal. And what ended up happening was, it did systematically make it difficult for more African Americans to exercise their political rights. For whites in the South, they didn't have to deal with that because they had something called grandfather clauses. And grandfather clauses essentially said that if your grandfather could vote, then you could too. And so that meant that a lot of like Southern whites were excluded from these poll taxes and literacy tests, but African Americans weren't because a lot of their grandfathers had been enslaved. In addition to these poll taxes and literacy tests, we also see Jim Crow laws coming in. And this becomes one of the things that defines the New South for African Americans during this time period. So while black codes are gone and while slavery is gone, these Jim Crow laws sought to create two separate societies, a white society and a black society, and then basically try to make African Americans within the South feel inferior through like separate schools, separate water fountains, separate areas of movie theaters, separate places to ride on the bus, separate places to eat in a restaurant. And these laws were justified by the Supreme Court in the Plessy v. Ferguson case. Which was in 1896. Now, the Plessy v. Ferguson case argued that the segregation was constitutional as long as it maintained separate but equal. But the reality is that while they were very concerned about the separation part of these Jim Crow laws, no one was really trying to make things equal. In fact, it was inherently unequal. And so we see these Jim Crow laws representing a major challenge to African American rights, especially in the New South following the Civil War. In addition to that, we also see a rise of violence towards African Americans, and we see a rise in more lynchings, especially in the South, in order to enforce these Jim Crow laws. And it is important to understand that Jim Crow laws were, for the most part, enforced largely through not only legal actions, but fear. We have a number of African American voices that are speaking out against these lynchings, including people like Ida B. Wells, who's a journalist who becomes an outspoken critic of the New South and some of the violence that African Americans are facing during this time period. Other people that are outspoken during this time period for African Americans would be figures like Booker T. Washington, who was concerned about inequality between African Americans and believed that the best way for African Americans to gain more rights and to gain more freedom in society following the Civil War would be to improve their education, improve their economic standing, which is why he advocated for industrial skills and helped open the Tuskegee Institute. Now, this all represents what's happening in the South. But obviously, African American history is more than just Southern history, and we have to acknowledge that African Americans are playing an important role in the West and in the North, and we want to kind of talk about how that is. So African Americans are moving out west, and they're doing something. They're becoming a lot of African Americans are leaving the Deep South after the Civil War, and especially after the failures of Reconstruction, and moving on to the plains. they're becoming what we refer to them as exodusters. Essentially, they were African Americans who took up like the economic opportunities of the Homestead Act that was passed in 1862, went and tried to take advantage of the mining frontier and some of the other things that were being offered in the West for a better life. In the North, African Americans were playing an important role in the development of industrialization. And they were working a lot of the jobs that were happening in cities. And they were joining just along other Americans, labor movements to fight for greater working equality. And we see that with groups like the Knights of Labor. And the Knights of Labor was not solely it wasn't a white organization. It was an organization that allowed all types of laborers, including African Americans and women. Okay, so like I said, once again, we see some major challenges to African Americans, but we also see new opportunities as well. Starting in 1900 to 1920, this would be the era known as the Progressive Era. Sorry, my handwriting's terrible. Okay, so we got the Progressive Era that's taking place. So what's going on in the Progressive Era? So the biggest thing about the Progressive Era is that there's tons of reforms that are happening within our country. The downside is that there's a lot of progress being made. The role of government is expanding, and they're dealing with a whole host of different issues that are facing like our society. A lot of progress is not being made in terms of African American rights. In fact, I'd say one of the greatest failures of the progressive movement was the fact that it really didn't address a lot of the issues that we just talked about that were emerging out of the New South especially. Progressives really don't meet the needs of a lot of African Americans. So progressivism doesn't really address the problems facing African Americans in society between 1900 and 1920. That doesn't mean that African American voices aren't actively talking about these problems the same way that like muckrakers and other like people are talking about other problems. So obviously I talked about Ida B. Wells is going to continue in the progressive era to be a voice who's campaigning against obviously violence in the South and lynchings. But there are other voices as well. We talked about Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington is also active in this time period, fighting for greater education, access to greater education, and more economic power for African Americans. We see new voices, though, also emerge in the progressive era. Probably one of the most important would be W.E.B. Du Bois. And Du Bois is going to be different from Washington in that where Washington focuses on maybe, say, economic improvement for African Americans, Du Bois is going to focus more on immediate reestablishment of civil rights. So W.E.B. Du Bois wants to reestablish the right to vote. He wants to eliminate Jim Crow laws. He feels like those are the things that African Americans need to be focusing on right away. And out of his philosophies come two really important movements and organizations. So he's part of something called the Niagara Movement. And then maybe more importantly, is he helps establish the NAACP, which is going to be a force for fighting for civil rights for African Americans, even to this day. Okay, now, in addition to obviously what we're seeing here, we also see another major event in African American history, which is the beginnings of the Great Migration. And the Great Migration is really going to begin in the 1900s during the Progressive Era, closer to like World War I, and it's going to carry through all the way through World War II. So this is happening from really World War I to through World War II. And what's happening is African Americans are leaving the South in larger numbers and migrating into the North for better opportunities. The promise of industrial jobs, the promise of greater freedoms, no longer like Jim Crow laws and poll taxes and literacy tests, and some of the threats of threats they experienced in the New South. Now, the Great Migration obviously is going to lead to a huge demographic shift in the United States as African Americans move to St. Louis and Chicago and New York. But it's also important to acknowledge that African Americans, even as they move from the New South into like areas like the North, like cities like Chicago, are going to still face challenges and discrimination. And I'm going to talk about more about that when I get into the Roaring Twenties. But I just want to note that right here. The last thing I want to say about this time period is that African Americans are going to be major contributors to foreign policy for the United States, and especially during World War I. So during World War I, you got over 400,000 African Americans who are going to serve in that war. And they're going to fight for the promise of making the world safe for democracy. So that takes us into 1920. And in 1920, the era that we're talking about here is the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression. So the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression, this is following World War I. America is kind of culturally shifting. We see new civil rights figures emerge. And we also see a flowering of African-American culture, especially in the like northern cities like New York. So during the Roaring Twenties, we've got new civil rights leaders emerging like Marcus Garvey. And for those that don't remember Marcus Garvey was an African-American leader. He's actually originally from Jamaica. And he advocated for Black nationalism, greater pride in African heritage. And he even advocated at one point a Back to Africa campaign, which was rather controversial. He established the UNIA. And he had gained a lot of followers within the United States in the 1910s and then the 1920s. Another important event involving African American history is the growth of the Harlem Renaissance during this time period. And it is important to note that African culture, which is moving, African American culture, which is moving out of like the New South, is one of the driving factors of some of the cultural changes that are happening in America in the 1920s. We see the growth of the jazz age. Well, jazz is being pioneered by Black musicians, people like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. You've got the growth of poetry that is from an African-American perspective, like Langston Hughes. During the New Deal, we also see some changes in African-American history. And during the New Deal, there is advances made in terms of the government including African-Americans in more government programs. So the New Deal under FDR does a number of programs that are more inclusive than government programs prior to this time period. So we saw like during the Progressive era, there wasn't a lot of programs that were designed to help African Americans. But under FDR, we see more signs that the Democratic Party and FDR are reaching out to try to provide support for African Americans who were struggling during the Great Depression the same way as all other Americans. And we see that with like the CCC, which did also hire young Black men, the WPA, which offered construction opportunities, and then the establishment of the Federal Council on Negro Affairs. Which actually, the purpose of that was to provide more help for African Americans and more opportunities within the New Deal for African Americans. So this helps establish the New Deal coalition. And one of the reasons why African Americans go from voting largely Republican prior to this time period to voting Democratic during this time period is because of the things that the New Deal was doing to provide them with opportunities that maybe prior to that time during the Progressive Era and during the Roaring '20s, they had been denied. Now, that's not to say that African Americans didn't still face major discrimination and challenges. One of the biggest things that happened as the Great Migration took place is African Americans moving into the North faced racial segregation in northern cities. So we tend to think of segregation as being something that only existed in the South, but that wasn't actually the case. There was lots of segregation that was happening in the North as well. It was just happening in different ways. Instead of segregating all parts of society, like movie theaters and buses and schools, what we see in northern cities was segregation of housing. So there were neighborhoods that were predominantly white. There were neighborhoods that were predominantly black. And there were basically like policies in which real estate brokers and other people would only show African Americans housing in certain parts of the city. And so we have like segregation actually being created through housing that's happening in northern cities. And we kind of see evidence, we definitely still see evidence of that segregation in our cities today, as we kind of see like large racial divides in places like Chicago, in places like New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and so on, that can be rooted in the 1920s and the 1930s. All right, that takes us to 1941. So our last era. And between 1941 and 1945, we really have World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. Okay, so in this era, there are some major advances made in terms of civil rights. And it's important to note that we think of like the modern civil rights era, which is Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks and the SCLC and SNCC. Like those organizations are rooted in some of the things that happened in these previous time periods, especially in like World War II. So out of World War II comes some major advances for civil rights for African Americans. A good example is we've got new leaders that are emerging, like A. Philip Randolph. And A. Philip Randolph was a labor organizer who actually starts to, he's the first person to propose a march on Washington. In support of jobs for African Americans and greater economic equality. He proposes that in 1941, and that is going to be fulfilled by 1963, and that's where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. We also have the establishment of organizations like CORE. CORE, which was established in 1942, stands for Congress on Racial Equality. And this was a early civil rights organization that was committed to nonviolence, to civil disobedience, and it's going to be really, really influential in the 1940s and 1950s, especially in northern cities. And then by the late 50s and early 60s, it starts to organize actions in the South like the Freedom Rides. And then, of course, you've also got the Double V campaign, which is ongoing during World War II. And the Double V campaign is all about victory at home against racism, victory over in Europe against fascism and against Nazi Germany, Mussolini, and fascist Italy, and of course also Imperial Japan. And the idea is that African Americans were going to fight for freedom overseas, but they were also going to make greater gains here within this country. And after World War II ends, we see those gains being made in the mobilization of the civil rights movement. And like obviously, by 1954, you've got the Brown v. Board of Education decision. And then shortly after that, you got the Montgomery bus boycott, the establishment of the SCLC. You've got the March on Birmingham, and you've got some really, really important major events in the civil rights movement that is going to just strip away some of the discrimination that we can trace all the way back to the era of the Civil War and even before that. So this is what you have to be well aware of. It's an important story that's worth knowing, and obviously this story is connected to, as I said, so many other stories in our class. It's connected to the New Deal, it's connected to the Civil War, it's connected to the Revolution, it's connected to everything. And so just understanding this story and how obviously it's very important to who we are as Americans today is really kind of what I want you to kind of think about as you go through this. All right, so that's all I got for you guys.